right, let's move on and talk about social cognition and understanding others. Social cognition is the cognitive processes with which people understand and make sense of others and themselves. The cognitive processes by which people understand and make sense of others as well as themselves. And a lot of times we do this through what are called schemas. Schemas are organized bodies of information that are stored in memory that bias the way new information is interpreted, stored, and recalled. So you have a schema for a classroom. If I were to say to you, what is a classroom? You may say it is where students meet and there is a whiteboard and there are chairs and there's a teacher and there are students, things like that. Maybe you have a schema for a library. Maybe you have a schema for college. Maybe you have a schema for a firehouse, right? It's this organized way of thinking that is stored in memory. And it helps predict what others are like based on relatively little information. Now, some of the earlier work that we have, right, on social cognition. The earliest work on social cognition examined impression information, which is the process by which an individual organizes information about another person to form an overall impression of that person. So again, let me reread that. Impression formation. I keep wanting to say it incorrectly. Impression formation is the process by which an individual organizes information about another person in order to form an overall impression of that person. And we do this through what are called central traits. Back in chapter 13 on the chapter on personality, remember we did discuss traits and trait theories. Well, central traits are the major traits considered in informing impressions of others. And usually we calculate some sort of psychological average on the individual traits that we see in a person. We tend to form impressions very quickly on people. And a lot of times, the state of mind or the mood that we are in affects how we perceive others. If you're in a really crappy mood someday, you may, really be saying, oh, you meet someone new, and because you're in a bad state of mind, you're in a bad mood, you will not have as positive of an impression on someone as if you were, what would happen if you were in a good mood that day. We don't think about those things, but they really do have an effect on us, the impressions that we make on others. Now, when we make an impression, or when we form an impression, when we form an impression on someone else, what we're actually doing is we're going through what is called an attribution process, where we're trying to understand the causes of behavior. Attribution processes are understanding the causes of behavior, and we have what is called an attribution theory. This considers how we decide on the basis of samples of a person's behavior what the specific causes of that behavior. So what are we attributing their behavior to, right? That's what we talk about with this attribution process. A lot of times we ask that why question. Why are they doing that? Why did they do that? We're trying to find cause for why someone behaves the way they do. And we have two different types of causes for behavior. We have a situational cause and we have a dispositional cause. Okay, so first off, the situational cause. This is the causes of behavior that are external to a person. The causes of behavior that are external to that person. So they are out of that person's control. We also have what is called a dispositional cause of behavior. This is the perceived causes of behavior brought about by a person's traits or personality characteristics. So let's say, for example, that you fail a test. You may say that you failed that test because the teacher made it too difficult. What type of cause would that be? Situational or dispositional? It would be a situational cause. It's out of your control, right? It's external to you. Now, let's say that someone else failed a test. And you would say, well, it's because they didn't study that much. They were out partying all night the night before. That would then be dispositional. Now, so when we fail a test, it is usually situational. However, when we do really well and we ace a test and we get an A on it, it becomes dispositional. It's because we studied really hard. It wasn't because the teacher made it too easy. It's because we studied really hard. So you see the difference between the situational and the dispositional causes of behavior. Okay, so let's talk about attribution biases. And this is where to err is human. So this is where I'm going to talk a little bit more in the next two slides about the way that we look at our errors as opposed to the way that we look at others' errors. So we have what is called the halo effect. This is a phenomenon in which there is an initial understanding that a person has positive or negative traits that are used to infer other uniformly positive or negative characteristics. The halo effect is a phenomenon in which there is an initial understanding that a person has positive or negative traits that are used to infer other uniformly positive or negative characteristics. We also have what is called the assumed similarity bias. This is the tendency to think of people as being similar to yourself even when meeting them for the very first time. The tendency to think of people as being similar to yourself even when you're meeting them for the first time. And given how diverse people are in the world, this assumed similarity bias, often impairs our ability to make accurate judgments. Given the diversity of people in the world, this assumption often impairs our ability to make accurate judgments. Now, getting back to what I was saying previously, right, where if I fail an exam and get an F, it's because the teacher made the exam too hard. However, if I do really well and I ace the exam and I get an A, it's because I studied really hard, right? Or let's say that you are in the lunchroom or in the cafeteria or in the break room and you see someone trip and they drop their whole tray of food. And you may say, oh my gosh, they are so clumsy. I don't know why they don't watch where they're going. And then the next day, you stumble over something and you drop your tray of food. And you're like, oh my gosh, it's just because, they piled so much food on this tray, or this person had their chair pulled out, or they just got done washing the floor and it was slippery. See how you put the blame on someone else because it's them? But whenever it comes to us, it's because it's something outside of our control. That's what we're going to talk about in this slide. So we have what is called a self-serving bias. That is the tendency to attribute success to personal factors, skill, ability, or effort, and failures to factors outside of ourselves. Again, if I do really well on the exam and I get an A, it's because I studied really hard. I showed up to class, I read my textbook, and I really put forth the effort, and that's why I did well. However, if I fail the exam, that's because, the exam was made too difficult. So that's the self-serving bias. We also have what is called the fundamental attribution error. This is a tendency to over-attribute others' behaviors to dispositional causes and minimize the importance of situational causes. So if someone else fails the exam, it's because they didn't study. It's not because the exam was too hard. So when it comes to ourselves, we use a self-serving bias, but when it comes to others, we use this fundamental attribution error, where we tend to come up with a reason for their behavior as dispositional instead of situational. This awareness of the attribution bias has led in part to a new branch of economics called behavioral economics. And that is concerned with how economic conditions are affected by biases and irrationality. Okay, let's continue on and let's move on to